Welcome all. We are absolutely thrilled to have you here for our conversation about a book that comes out today, ReaderBot: What Happens When AI Reads and Why It Matters. And we are thrilled to be joined by the author of the book, Naomi Barron, who is a professor emerita at American University and a very distinguished scholar. On a afternoon like this one, I'm grateful to say I'm Seth Green. I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago. Welcome to our snowy campus where it is freezing cold, and we are all thrilled to be able to be inside during this conversation and yet to have a lot of sun pouring in despite the cold through the windows. For those of you who don't know us, we are 135 years young as of this upcoming academic year. And we are the home of lifelong learning at the University of Chicago because when the university was founded, there was a vision to ensure that individuals could access the extraordinary ideas here in non-traditional ways and across all chapters of life. And we are the extension that makes that mission possible. And I'll just mention that we have a number of other upcoming events. We have later this week on Thursday an information session about our inaugural Graham Summer School, which will be devoted this inaugural edition to America at 250 and deep reading and conversations about civic virtue. We then have coming up in February a feast of events and experiences, including an in-person conversation at our Gleacher Center with Deborah Rutter over breakfast. She was the head of the Kennedy Center until recently, and we'll talk about the case for the arts and also reflect on where she believes we are in this moment. And then we'll have a lunch later that week with Michelle Lowry, one of the most distinguished classicists here at the university. And she will look at the Arapacis and she will offer insights that are especially relevant to a group of Graham learners that are headed to Rome and will see that for themselves. And I will just mention that spring courses are now open and actually filling up quite quickly. So Marina will be putting in the chat momentarily for those who want to get ahead, even though you can't quite feel spring at this moment. It will be here soon, and there is a feast of learning opportunities. All right, but let me take down my screen because the reason that you are all here is to learn from Naomi Barron. So let me add a spotlight there. Hello, Naomi. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. And let me just share a little bit about Naomi before we get into our conversation. Her research interests include language and technology, reading, first language acquisition, the relationship between speech and writing, the history and structure of English, and higher education. She is extraordinarily accomplished. She is a former Guggenheim Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow, a Fulbright Specialist, and a former visiting scholar at the Stanford Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. She has published 10 books, and we are really excited to talk with her about this one, which is at once at the very forefront in incorporating these questions around AI, and it takes us back to some of the fundamentals in terms of reading. And so to get us started, Naomi, you've written extensively about how we write and read in the digital age, and you've spent decades teaching and observing how students engage with text. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit about what led you to these questions around AI as reader and seeing that as the next critical frontier to explore.
Here's my path. For years, I, along with a lot of other people, have noticed that the amount of reading that students are willing to do has declined. And as a matter of fact, a colleague of mine, Anna Mangan in Norway, who works a lot on reading issues, together we did a study on faculty members in the United States and in Norway on how much they're assigning and why the amount has gone down. And it's pretty clear it's gone down in significant part because students weren't doing the reading. We know when we look at international statistics that the amount of reading that students do because of choice has gone down. So the 2018 PISA study showed that 49% of 15-year-olds were only reading when they had to. And 10 years before that, it was only 36 were reading because they had to, and the rest were reading because they wanted to. And then you look at the number of Americans who are reading a book each year, of adults, it's gone down. In Korea, it's gone down in lots of countries. Similarly, reading test scores have gone down. Now AI comes, and it came in some earlier versions, even before we called it AI, we just called it computers, a tool such as Grammarly that would clean up your writing for you. Um, and then OpenAI started developing what it didn't call GPT-1, but it was. And then there was 2. And when 3 came along in 2020, there were a number of companies such as Sudowrite that made tools available that are sort of like ChatGPT. And we became aware as these tools became better and better known, particularly with the development of ChatGPT, that a lot of writing could be done on our behalf. But in order for that to happen, you had to have text that could be, quotes, read. And we'll talk a little later about what that means. So now we have my need to put 2 and 2 together. So if LLMs, large language models, have to read something in order to write something, well, what happens when they read on our behalf, where the goal is not to do the writing for us, but to do the reading and then write something such that we can pretend to have read the original work ourselves? And then there was a sprinkling of articles that started coming out really only in about 2024 that said, oh, guess what? Students are now doing their reading, quote unquote, by letting AI do it for them. And in the research world, increasingly, researchers have been using various kinds of tools to locate articles, to summarize articles, to compare results, and so forth. So what I see happening to put all this together is a kind of perfect storm between declines in voluntary or obligatory reading and the power of AI to read for us. It was time to study this and write a book.
Well, and so let's dig into the topic. So we have a course here at the Graham School that is currently exploring this question of what counts as intelligence and thinking, and what happens when we task AI to quote unquote think. And so in that spirit, can you walk us through what's fundamentally different about how, let's say, a large language model reads in quotes, because I don't know if we consider that reading, but how a large language model reads versus how you and I read, and why that difference matters.
Start with the question of why humans read. And that's a very complex topic, but I'll boil it down for our purposes to one thing, because we want to derive linguistic meaning. And we derive that meaning not just from the particular text we're reading at that moment, but by reflecting on other things we've read, other experiences we've had, conversations we've had, challenges we've encountered. So reading to us is a derivation of meaning that happens in a larger context of our lives. When we
Mhm.
read, there's a direct relationship between the human author and the author's text and us, the reader. So what happens with AI? AI is not in the business of making sense. It's not in the business of figuring out what language means. Rather, it's in the statistical prediction business of what is most likely to be the next word. And when you look at the relationship between an author and a reader, what you have is a mediated relationship rather than a direct one. So you still have the human author and the human text. What happens next? The AI, at least with generative AI and large language models, goes to work in tokenizing, that is breaking into pieces that are almost like a word, but not quite. And then it feeds, after it's put that text into its data set, and then it goes to work, quotes, reading, meaning predicting what's next, what is most likely to be the next word. And then it writes something for us that we humans then read. But what we're reading is AI text. We're not reading human text. The human is still reading something, but what the human is reading is not what the author wrote. So why does this difference matter? Because humans have reasons to read. AI has no rationale for doing reading. And we have all kinds of reasons. We read to relax, we read to escape, we read to reflex, we read to empathize, we read to learn, we read to analyze and compare. And if we take away the impetus for doing those kinds of things by letting AI do the reading for us, then we undermine our motivations for reading to relax or escape, or for the aesthetics of reading, or to empathize, or to psychologically mature through identification with characters or whatever. And we also end up weakening our more analytical skills,
Hmm.
which we'll talk about a little later because there's some really interesting research out there that's just starting to come. All right, so what are the implications for society? Quickly. Uh, Societies are made up of people who have cognitive abilities, they have personalities, they have values, and to a large extent, who we are is shaped by our culture. If you're in a literate culture, that's heavily shaped then, but you are heavily shaped by education, formal or informal, and by the written word. So when we cease to read, either voluntarily or through obligation, we're not in a position to contribute to strengthening that social factor of the community of which we are part.
Hmm. Well, so I want to dive further into this, Naomi, because you've studied over your career language acquisition and
Yeah.
how technologies before this one have shaped our cognitive engagement with text. And so this is not just something you're coming to now, this is something that you've looked at throughout your life. And obviously the technology has gotten more and more developed and exciting over that period. And so from that extensive work that you've done on reading behaviors, as well as decades that you mentioned in the classrooms with students who are, as you said, changing, what concerns you most about the cognitive habits? I mean, you just described societally, but for that individual, and that student, let's say, that's growing up in this different world where they're using AI as the intermediary, what are the concerns you have about the cognitive habits and critical thinking skills we might lose when we let AI essentially process and synthesize text for us rather than doing it ourselves? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what you've observed in how you're seeing students think differently when they read this way than they may have done a generation ago.
Okay. My answer is a little longish, so bear with me, everyone, please. I'd like to start with a kind of overarching picture, which is what I've been thinking about over the last month or so, on how to really get our hands on understanding what is happening to us when we let AI read for us, because it's not a simple answer. And the way that I've done that is to reflect on a lot of the other research that I and various other people have done on what I call your brain on silicon, which means digital chips which run lots of things, including televisions for quite some time, including digital reading, including the ways we search for information. In fact, let me just give you the little list. I've done a lot of research on the differences between reading in print versus reading digitally. And we know there's some cognitive differences there. We also know that the way that we search for information has shifted with the development of silicon chips and software to go with it. Instead of spending our time in libraries, and I know the Regenstein and I would love to go back there anytime,
Mhm.
we turn to Wikipedia, or now we turn to online searching. We use our mobile phones for so many different functions. We use social media, both what I call static social media of some kinds of messages that are essentially text, as well as for short videos. And I'll talk about the importance of those in a second. And now we have generative AI that writes and reads, as well as all the other things that we won't be dealing with today. So my hunch now is that if we really want to understand how AI is affecting the way we read, we would learn a lot by looking at what we already know from the research that goes back almost 2 decades now on ways in which these digital technologies are affecting thinking.
Hmm.
So the first thing to understand about that relationship between digital stuff in general and AI and reading in general is that reading is a linear activity. But digital technologies, forget about digital TVs for the moment, but the ways that we access text digitally is very fragmented. It's not, and it's digital, it's not analog. And therefore, what we have developed over use of these various technologies is an approach to text that anticipates it being disjointed,
Mm.
anticipates distractions coming, anticipates fragmented attention. And indeed, there's now lots of research that is indicating that using these various kinds of technologies is ending up in distraction, is ending up in cognitive deficit, and so forth. So just a really quick rundown to summarize some of the research that others have done, but I have benefited from. So take research on doing online searching. And now what I'll talk about for this list that I'll go through is what I'll call the cognitive effects of the brain on silicon. That is things that you can measure in terms of brain functionality, and whether that's with uh, a functional MRI scan, or whether it's with a cognitive test you give, or whether it's with people reporting what they perceive. So research on online searching. We know it reduces your memory for what you read, and it also leads us to believe that we already knew what we actually only learned by looking up online. Mobile phones, there's lots of data showing that we have a reduction in our sustained attention, and it reduces and having a phone physically present, even if it's turned off, reduces our cognitive capacity compared with if the phone is in our backpack or if it's in another room. We know that heavy use of social media reduces our cognitive capacities and is correlated with inattention on various attention tests. We know that things like TikTok, um, a heavy use of TikTok correlates with poor performance on attention tests. We know that general use of AI, and now I'll get to AI in particular, um, for self-reports um, shows reduced cognitive effort, and people will tell you I wasn't thinking as much. We
Mm.
know that for writing, when you do studies, and there was the study that probably everyone has been talking about that came out in June um, that showed, and it was largely people at MIT who showed with EEG studies that there was less cognitive activity when people were doing writing using AI, whereas if they were just using their brains, there was stronger brain connectivity, a higher sense of ownership. And I'm going to stress that ownership issue because I'll come back to it. Um, you were better able, if you'd written the thing yourself as opposed to AI writing it for you, to quote your report, to quote your own work, and you also wrote a better essay. And then there's the reading question. There's very little research at this point, understandably, on whether using AI to read for you is having cognitive effects. There was a study done at the University of Pennsylvania that recently came out that showed if you essentially are using AI overviews in Google to give you an answer to a question, as opposed to doing a search yourself and having to read yourself some of those sources, and then you were asked in this test to write an advice letter to somebody about the topic. If you used AI overviews, you put forth less effort, you learned less, your essay was less good, and you had less of a sense of ownership of that essay that you then produced.
Mm.
When we read, we take ownership of our reading. And then just a couple of things on brain structure, because there's some really interesting research coming. We don't yet really have anything on reading, but we have it on use of screens. And there are lots of studies coming out, largely from the work of a man named John Hutton, who's a pediatrician, showing that there are brain differences between preschoolers and pre-adolescents. For those
Wow.
who use screens a lot, versus those who don't. And the differences are the areas that develop language and develop cognitive abilities. So that to me is a frightening statistic, but
Yeah.
it has been reproduced. Now, the question about what do I see in student behavior?
Yeah.
This is an interesting one because AI is just the very newest of these tools that reads for us. We had plot summaries, we had those introductory critical essays that told us sort of what the book was about before we got to the literary work. We had cliff notes and spark notes, and people have read selectively for quite some time. So AI comes along, and is it really different when we say, either, Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and this essay's due tomorrow and just write me one because read the book. I don't have time to do it. Thank you. We've been doing that kind of thing for a long time. Now, I know that we're interested in the question of, well, are we doing deep reading anymore because of AI? And University of Chicago students accepted. uh,
Mhm.
Most students haven't been doing much deep reading before this anyway, before AI came along. So it's really hard to answer the question I know we would all like to, of how is letting AI read for us
Right.
changing our ability to read deeply? We're going to have to wait a while, but my recommendation is we don't wait. We do some things proactively, and we can get to those a little later today.
Naomi, before we go on, can I ask about a metaphor in my mind and whether
Of
you think it's
course.
valid? So we're having a whole discussion in the country right now about ultra-processed foods. And the idea, as I understand it, is that it kind of takes all of these nutrients, it weaves them together in an unnatural way. It's highly palatable. It gives us a really clean kind of dopamine impact. And then
Right.
once we start eating these foods, it's really hard to return to salads because it turns out that the natural world doesn't give us that level of impact as quickly and as concentrated, right? The challenge, though, is that once we get hooked on ultra processed foods, right, we lose the discipline to eat the healthy nutrients and to grow our bodies in a sustainable way. And just as
Right.
you're describing what's happening in the technology world, where essentially it's kind of taking this all, packaging it for us in a concentrated way. We don't have to read the original. We can just get
Mhm.
the outcome, right? But the journey of reading that text deeply is actually that I'm working out my muscles. I'm gaining,
Right.
a lot of cognitive skill along the way, and I'm gaining the discipline to actually stick with a deep thought and think critically. And so, is there any analogy there that resonates for you? Because in some ways I see like what happened with ultra processed in the 1980s was like, oh my God, we've solved food. We took all of these nutrients, we put them into a package, and now voila, you're done. Right. And I feel like in some ways we're going to wake up to this 20 or 30 years from now and say, oh my God, just like our bodies have not been well served, arguably, we're going to look back and say our minds have not been well served. And so I'm just curious to test that metaphor that's just lingering in my mind, if that makes any sense to you as someone who knows a lot more.
Well, it's a very good analogy, and I actually talk about ultra-processed text in the book. Um, More than a century ago, there was, we'll call it beginning in the sometime in the mid 19th century, there was what was called the mental muscle theory, which said the reason to learn Latin is, there aren't a whole lot of Romans still around of the older variety, but it disciplines the mind. And your brain is not actually a muscle, but you do discipline it through use. And the
Right,
idea was not as crazy as it sounded. And maybe we shouldn't be learning Latin, but we should be learning other things. Um, it is absolutely the case that we become acclimatized to doing things without putting forth much effort. We become acclimatized, for example, to driving an automatic car. And today we don't even talk about automatic cars versus stick shifts because the stick shift is the exception, right?
right,
But trust me, if you ever are in a situation where you went to rent a car and they had no automatics and they only had a stick shift and you never learned how to drive a stick shift, which happened
right.
to
You would
me
not be safe.
in Shannon Airport a number of decades ago, I was in deep trouble. And immediately I had to learn and get on the highway with a car I'd never learned how to drive before. Okay, so absolutely, we get used to conveniences And then the question is, are we still capable of doing something if we don't have that convenience? So, for example, um, as AI capabilities started coming into law firms sort of 3, 4 years ago, one of the things that law firms started worrying about is because these tools were good and they've gotten much better over the last couple of years, would lawyers any longer know how to write a brief?
Right.
Would they know how to write anything in a legal capacity without that tool available? And we already know that these tools can be very useful, except when they make major mistakes, which is more often than you want to charge a client 500 or $1,000 an hour for.
Mhm.
Okay, so I think it's incredibly important that we ask, what are the things worth doing? So uh, present administration accepted, political administration accepted, there are a lot of people who are understanding the importance of not eating ultra-processed food, most of ultra-processed food, the importance of exercise, knowing something about how your body works and why it's important to do various things. So it's not as if we've all given up on the importance of eating real food, but it's that we have to work at it. And the question
Right.
is, how much effort are we willing to put forth? And that's exactly the same thing with reading, with writing, with coding. Now, you look at the literature now on how important is it that AI can do coding, and the answer is for the simple stuff, it's probably fine, but we still need people who really understand what works and what doesn't work with complex programs.
Well, so let me ask you, because I imagine you are not of the mind that there's no value to AI. And so, are there certain types of reading or other activities where you say, that's a good one for AI assistance and it might actually enhance our understanding, and then others where you say you should never outsource? I mean, it's kind of like technology. We have kids. There are a handful of things that you let them do on phones, and 90, probably 5% of things we don't, but those handful of things are actually beneficial because they're increasing the amount of social activity they have with their friends and things like that. So we've kind of really been careful about, okay, this technology is not inherently good or bad, but you want to use it really carefully so that you can gain the benefits without the really significant risks. As you think about AI and reading, what's your prescription for all of us in terms of ways we can use it that are not necessarily undermining our cognitive versus things we should really watch out for?
Or let me just begin by putting in a plug for a wonderful organization called Children and Screens, which studies digital media and asks what are the kinds of things that are useful for kids? What are the kinds of
Mhm.
things where we need to step back and say, maybe this is not going to be as helpful as the big tech companies that are trying to sell us on it would lead us to believe. There's a really nice article that came out in the Washington Post in June, written by a man named Gregory Fowler. And the reason I'm mentioning it is he did an experiment, and he lined up 5 AI bots and gave them reading assignments. He gave them reading assignments, one in literature, one in law, one in health science, and one in politics. It happened to be some of Trump's speeches, which is relevant for a reason that'll come clear. And then he lined up 4 experts in these various fields to judge the responses that were given by the AI bots to questions. So these were factual questions, they were analysis questions, they were how would you improve this document questions, it was fact checking, that kind of stuff. Okay. And each of the 4 judges did their judging on a 10-point scale, with 1 being you misinterpreted, you blew it. Just 3 being, well, you got at least 1 fact wrong. 6, it's correct, but you left some points out. And 10, you blew me away. Okay. The results for literature, which got the lowest of all the scores, um, occasionally it would do something really smart, but the person judging said, no, you don't want this doing your reading for you. This meaning one of these bots.
Right. Yeah.
Law oversimplified things. And they would take a complex issue and turn it into one sentence, which lawyers knew a real lawyer who would missed out on some of the important issues. That is, it lacked nuance. The health sciences they did pretty well on, they meaning the bots. And that's in large part because there's a structure to scientific articles as to how they proceed and where to find what. There are huge data sets now for scientific articles. So getting things right is probably easier in the sciences than it is in a number of other areas. Politics, again, it was two speeches of Trump. Um, the challenge was in distinguishing between what was asserted by the writer and what was actually meant. Okay. Some bots did better than others. It was Claude, Anthropic's Claude, that did the best overall. Next was ChatGPT, and the other three were sort of left in the dust. And they did better on some bots did better on some genres than others. So at least looking at grading how they work, there's no simple answer because it depends on the genre and the bot that you're using as to how much you can rely on it. Okay, but what do I think? Okay, so let's look at literature. What are some places that I think you can make positive use of AI in reading? The first is what I call co-reading. So, for example, if I'm tackling Anna Karenina, and I'm really confused by how many characters there are and what is their actual name, because in Russian there are so many versions of the name that's being presented. So to use AI to, please give me a dramatis personae of Anna Karenina. So I have this list in front of me. I mean, Shakespeare was good about doing it, and so are a few other writers, but it can be helpful to guide me through the book. Remember Cliff Notes. Okay. The way Cliff Notes are used, have been used, or their modern equivalents are used, is not the way they were designed. They were designed to be used, and I'll quote from the Cliff Notes site. Use Cliff Notes literature guides as a study guide, a tool to help you understand literature. Most people use Cliff Notes by reading a chapter of the book or an act of the play, and then reading the corresponding section in Cliff Notes. Alternatively, read the entire book or play and then review with Cliff Notes. That's not what people do, but that's what they were originally designed in the late 1950s to do. Okay. Another use when it comes to literature, positive, is to make texts available to readers who, for one reason or another, can't tackle the original. So let's say you would like your 10-year-old to learn the story, or at least the basic outlines of the story of the Odyssey. Well, for that, uh, approaching what Homer did is probably going to be a little much. Okay, so you can easily tone down the level of the vocabulary and grammar in order to make it accessible. Or similarly, for non-native speakers of the language or people who are trying to learn the language, there are ways to simplify the text. And I think that's a terrific use of AI. For nonfiction narrative, things like essays, or for general informational text, there's so much we wouldn't read anyway if we had to do it ourselves, that letting AI in some ways summarize or analyze for us at least gives us something. For technical information, I think there's a positive for what I have come to call seriatim reading. So first to read some layperson's version of a technical piece, and then to be able to approach the technical piece, assuming that the AI is accurate. And I do this very often myself, more often when I can, if there is a tech journalist who has written a layperson's version, I read that. And because I'm not a computer scientist, and when I go to the technical articles, I don't always understand everything, but if I have a sense of where I'm heading, if I have Virgil as my guide, as it were, it helps me find my way through the articles. Negatives for literature. You miss all the benefits of reading if you let AI read for you. You don't get to relax, you don't get to escape to another world, you don't get to identify with the character, and on and on. Most importantly, though, what you miss out on is the language and the experience of owning the experience of reading. For non-technical narratives and sort of general informational text, Part of the question is whose perspective are you having imposed on you?
Right.
Because there is a perspective that that data set has come encoded with. And there was an interesting study that just came out recently on news stories and the kind of communication bias in large language models that will give you one view of the news that might be different from what you would come up with if you had seen an original yourself. Okay, same thing with technical information. I'm a big proponent of not believing the abstracts I read, whether it's written by a human or by AI, because often the thing I care most about in an article is in the article itself, not what happened to be in the abstract. Now, for my never list, poetry, unless it's something like the Iliad or the Odyssey or Paradise Lost, which is huge, and we'll just call it a book that happens to be in poetic form or any prose where the language matters.
Hmm. Well, so this is fascinating. I have more questions anyway, but I do want to start getting into our chat because it is filled with many great
Absolutely.
questions. I'm going to start with Ross Sweeney's. He asks, can you present AI with a prompt that will quote unquote solve its reading problems? So is there a way to prompt AI that can deal with some of the deficiencies you're describing?
Probably the best way to do it, and I'll give the analogy in a moment, is to feed it enough of your own writing about what you have read so that it emulates in its answers the things it predicts that you would write. So there are lots of businesses these days that are using Copilot tailored to their business, where they take a large amount of the emails that you have written and try to figure out your writing style for answering the emails. And there are, lots of other tools that are trying to emulate your style. So you might come up with a result that sounds more like you, but what have you missed out on?
And Thomas writes, if I use AI to identify readings based on an interest I present, do I lose anything by allowing AI to present the findings versus doing a traditional internet search? And I think he's hearkening back to your example, Naomi, where the person who did a Google search read everything, then had greater ownership, greater analytic abilities than the person who just took AI's answer. I think he's looking at an intermediate case here where AI is used to better perform the search, but then
Right.
you would then read those articles and analyze. Any thoughts on whether there is anything missing there
Lots.
in that approach?
Yeah, lots of thoughts. The first one is when you do a Google search these days, as we all know, the first thing that comes up is what Gemini
Right,
wants you
is
to
the
know.
Gemini.
Okay. The second thing that happens is look at how many options you were given for search. It used to be you just go screen after screen, and if you wanted to go to the 17th screen, you could find lots of stuff. The presentation of that now, of how much
Right,
you
is
should look at,
condensed.
is very, first of all, read me. I'm, the AI overview. And then, well, if you didn't like that, here are a couple of possibilities. And then you've got to click on next screen and you never know if there's much worth finding. So this goes back to the point that you had made earlier about overprocessed food, making it so easy for us to see something. And we
Yeah.
take the first thing that's given to us, and these days, overwhelmingly, it is AI generated. Okay, the notion of AI finding the articles for you and then saying, here's some things you might be interested in, which is basically what abstracts have done. And abstracts themselves have this interesting history that started with the Royal Society of London, and abstracts and scientific articles are actually fairly new. Anyway, the idea that here are some articles you might want to look at, and here's a summary, and here's a comparison. Now you go read them yourself. Right. How many of us are going to say, well, do I really need to? Because the work has been done for me. Again, there's that question of discipline of what is it you care enough about to go read yourself.
Well, so we have another question here from Paulette Field. Has there been a trend recently in published fiction, nonfiction and textbooks, to become more superficial in an effort to match this downturn in reading abilities? So, is there, a level to which this is creating, because
Yes,
we have a different ability of the student or the learner,
right.
creating new genres where even though you're reading what you are capable of as a TikTok lover, or how is it changing now what's written and how we see the trends of what's selling?
Okay, so permit me to talk very briefly about nonfiction, and then I will talk
Yes.
about fiction. One of the trends from a number of publishers has been, in addition to the traditional length monograph, so let's just talk about more technical monographs, whether they're academic or they're crossover books, to have a series that says we're going to do them as short, we're going to do some of these in short versions. So instead of a book that's 100,000 words, we're going to have, say, 40,000 words. And many well-known academic publishers, including my own, have versions of this because they know people are not buying
Right, the
and they're not
100,000.
reading the longer versions. Okay, now let's turn, and this has been happening for a number of years. Now let's turn to fiction. There are a number of fiction writers who have said, you know what, with the development, particularly of digital books, I now find that I need to write shorter books. I need to write books that are that even if they're fiction, they're not just a plot. You know, there are analytical pieces to it. They're reflective pieces where if we were reading in print more traditionally, we might go back and reflect on what we read, might go back to earlier pages and reread. And several authors who are well-known best-selling authors have said, I now write differently because my audience won't read the style of writing I used to write.
We have a question. You mentioned literacy. Could you please define literacy? For example, in many countries, an illiterate person may not be able to read the Iliad, but is savvy at giving you change when they sell you an item, whereas a person operating a till in the USA may not be savvy enough to give you change if you change the initial payment amount. I mean, I know that that's potentially math literacy as well, but maybe you could talk about reading literacy, especially how you define it, how you think about it, and then any other feedback on that question.
Sure. So defining literacy has for a long time been a complex issue. Does literacy entail knowing how to read the Bible? And you know how to read the Bible only because you've heard the stories and the Psalms and the passages read to you so many times in church. Do you actually know how to read? It used to be people in sort of early modern England learned to read by reading the Bible as their first book. Strange kind of primer. Does literacy include knowing how to write? Because there are lots of people who know how to read, but not how to write. And that's been true in many parts of the world. How much do you have to know how to read? The functional illiteracy rate in the United States, as of at least a couple of years ago, was 21% of the American population not being judged literate, meaning you have the basic skills necessary to apply for a job, to fill out a form. Now, that's not the Iliad, but it's that basic functionality that a lot of people haven't had. What does literacy mean now? Well, it depends on the country. It depends on what your goals are. That is, more people feel comfortable saying, of course I can read and I can analyze what I read, but I'm a lousy writer, so I can't write. Well, are writing skills needing to be up to the same snuff as reading skills in order to say you're literate? It depends on what the purpose is of asking the question.
We have a question from David Heinke. How do you defend against the threat that AI poses to scholars researching primary root sources? Any thoughts on that kind of broader question related to AI?
Let me see if I understand the question. There are all kinds of primary sources that got digitized, which is wonderful. So they're now available. And once they're digitized in principle, assuming you have legal right to get the texts if you're a big tech company, or you take them sometimes even without the legal rights, having those texts available to be mined is incredibly important. I mean, you think of all the people who have gotten PhDs in history, and it's taken them 8 to 10 years to do so because you spend so many years of your life in libraries and archives just trying to access text. So having that availability is terrific. But it's one thing to get a clue as to what's important in a text that otherwise you wouldn't have had access to. And it's another to ask, do I want to figure out for myself what this means and how it relates to the other texts that I've read or other things I've thought about? And it's that last step that we have to ask, are we still going to maintain the courage to to keep doing our own analysis, to make the analysis our own?
We have a question here from Sarah Young. Would love to know your thoughts or advice for parents of school-age children who haven't yet really been exposed to AI. I know my child's school system does address IDing fake sources, but so far, neither their STEM nor regular classes have addressed to parents or students the use of AI. I want to raise a critical thinker. Seems appropriate for our University of Chicago community. But at this point,
Yeah.
is it handicapping a child to not use any AI? So, I mean, obviously, you probably don't want to have no interaction with this. I mean, we talk a lot at the university about how we need our students to be able to think critically on their own and think critically with machines, because the future obviously will involve both. How do you think about that for that child development and what the role of parents in is probably in curating the right level of AI exposure and engagement?
Right. This is the 64, well, there's inflation, $64 trillion question that schools everywhere and parents are trying to figure out because through no fault of their own, it's really hard for any individual school or teacher within a school, whether that's K through 12 or whether it's university level, to know what's a good use of AI and what isn't. To cut to the chase on the first part of the question, it's absolutely critical to understand what this tool is and what its strengths are and what its weaknesses are. And if you just say, well, I want my child to be able to think on his or her own, and therefore I don't want to introduce AI. AI is coming in. AI is the algorithms behind TikTok and an awful lot of other
Yeah.
social media. It's going to happen anyway. And unless one talks about what it can do positively and what it does negatively, then you don't have a basis for making decisions. And sometimes schools will increasingly be able to do this as people work out useful pedagogies. The challenge is the AI capabilities keep shifting, so you make up this wonderful pedagogy that's out of date by the time it gets published.
Well, so I want to draw on your insights to a bigger question, Naomi. And you already referenced this at the outset, but I want to come back to it. I mean, here at the Graham School, we talk a lot about the reason that we deeply read texts, and in particular, we have a great books tradition, is because we believe that type of critical thinking and questioning is a resource for democracy, that being part of this conversation, having truly your own intellectual views on these things, it is the underpinning of citizenship because it allows you to uniquely contribute to democracy. And you think about a world in which everyone has the same large language model to analyze everything, right? And it's a very different type of democracy than one in which everyone is somewhat free thinking in their way of going about their involvement in citizenship and society. And so I'm curious what you see as the implications of all this for democracy and public discourse, and whether this could create new forms of information inequality.
I am so glad we got to this question because I did a little research in preparation. So the
Yeah,
question is, why does reading matter in a society? The answer to
yeah,
that question has differed at various points in history. So you have to have a society that believes that the written word matters for something. It used to matter to have legal texts available. It used to matter to have religious texts available. It mattered for religion with the Protestant Reformation, for example. In much of the world today, it still matters largely for economic betterment. And maybe democracy will follow, maybe it won't, but first you have to be able to feed yourself and your family. But now let's talk about participation in government. When the United States was founded, only people who owned property, and by the way, it was only males, were allowed to vote. There was a letter that was written by John Adams in 1776 to a friend and colleague who happened to be a judge in Massachusetts about why he, John Adams, believed it was important to own property. So let me just read this passage from the letter that Adams wrote.
Yeah.
Men in general in every society who are poor and don't own property are also unfamiliar with public affairs to form a right judgment, and too dependent upon other men to have a will of their own.
Hmm.
Few men, that is the ones, the syntax was crazy in the letter, but basically people who don't own property don't have judgments of their own. They talk and vote as they're directed by some man of property who has attached their minds to his interest. Now,
Hmm.
forget about whether we agree with Adams or not. As I read that, I said, that's what AI is doing. It's
Right.
being the people with property who are forming the opinions for us, and the rest of us unpropertied people, or the ones who are not expert in AI, or not in a position to do the reading and therefore the judging for ourselves, we are going to have our decisions made for us by those with property. But in Adam's case, he didn't want the rest of us voting. In our case, if we're lucky, we still have the franchise. We can still vote.
Well, so Naomi, we have time for one more question, and it's a
Okay.
selfish one on my part because I'm sitting here in higher education as dean of a school. And, I'm curious what your recommendations are for higher education. So, taking everything that we have discussed, the potential positives here in some limited ways, from being able to look at technical information, being able to get context as we read, and then the really serious risks that this new order presents. How do we in higher education navigate this in terms of really still delivering meaningful inquiry and growth and development for our students? How do we think about our role as knowledge creators in an environment that is going to be upended by this new world order? So I'm curious, if you had to list your top three recommendations for higher education in this moment of change, what would they be and why?
Okay. Permit me four, and I have to expand the
All right, we
universe.
will permit it in this case,
Thank
just
you
because you've
kindly.
been so brilliant this entire
Yeah,
conversation.
whatever. Okay. So I have this stepwise. Step one, read. Read more. Read in class. It's amazing the number of university faculty members who are now having students bring physical books to class and actually
Right.
doing the reading
Read
in class.
aloud.
Because then you know
Yeah.
that there's a chance that their eyes are covering the page and maybe their minds are doing some processing.
Just a
Um,
note of pride. We've been doing that for 80 years in our basic program. But I understand others are catching up to us.
okay, so you can read silently or read aloud. So there are people who are reading, where the faculty member or the students are reading aloud. There's a
Yes.
fascinating experiment that was done by Emanuela Castano. He's the person who, with David Kidd a number of years ago, looked at whether reading literary fiction does particular things for your mind. Anyway, the experiment they did was with elementary and middle school students, sorry, not higher education, but the principle applies. And they compared two groups of students. This was in Italy. One group of students had the teacher reading aloud stories to them. The other group of students spent exactly the same amount of time on language instructional activities. Then tests were done on their knowledge level, their thinking skills. And the ones who heard stories read to them scored higher in both cases.
Hmm.
So there's something about engaging with reading, sometimes in a social context, that can make a difference, and that can apply in higher education. Number two, or step two, don't assume that students know how to read, and I'll put scare quotes around it, deeply. Whatever the heck we mean by deep reading, that's a long conversation. There's a lot of evidence in high schools, in part because of the Common Core and the way curricula have changed, and because students weren't doing the reading anyway, that very little long form reading is being assigned. And therefore, colleges can't assume, maybe U of C can, but colleges can't
Oh,
assume.
we can't either. Absolutely. We have students coming from varied backgrounds in that regard.
Okay. So they can't, you can't assume, and this is before contemporary AI came along. You can't
Yeah.
assume that students know how to approach a text in depth. And therefore, step three, we need to model this kind of reading of what do we have in mind. We need to talk through the complexity of reading a complex text, or even reading what seems to be a simple text, but reading it in a nuanced, multifaceted way. And number four, and this is where the wider world comes in, we've got to figure out a way to make the adult population more generally do sustained reading. And I care less whether it's deep reading, but any kind of sustained reading. Oprah's original book club, think Chicago, um, had a lot of people reading and sometimes very difficult books because there was a support system to do it. And the problem now is that a number of people are dedicated readers. Most people are not. And there are too many competitions for our leisure time. And we have too many things we can do instead of reading ourselves, such as using AI. So we've got to take this as a social problem, just as health is a social problem, reading is a social problem for our sustenance as a society.
Well, Naomi, this has been a phenomenal conversation. You have, I mean, really brilliantly analyzed both the challenge, but also, I think, given us some really great food for thought on the solution. I will say, as we finish, I am incredibly proud that our school aims to be exactly what you describe, which is a community of individuals that are deeply committed to reading and inquiry and to the social experience of gaining and conveying knowledge. So it is a doubling down as I end this conversation on what we have to continue to grow in the future because it's so urgent for our society, for our democracy, and for each individual not to be, in Adam's terms, merely attaching themselves to a view, but to have the freedom and the empowerment to come to their own views and ultimately to make our society better through that diversity of wisdom and thought. So, thank you for your time. Thank you for what you're doing. It is very important and not easy in an AI generated world to be doing this original research and thought. And we're incredibly grateful to have had you here at the Graham School to share your wisdom. And good luck. Today is day one of this book, and we hope it is as successful as the nine others that you've written in terms of getting out there to the world.
Thank you much for the opportunity. Thank you all for the questions. And I congratulate the Graham School for the incredible work that you do.
Well, thank you. Have a great day, and thank you all.